like that song, so I'm going to keep playing it. All right. Sorry, my wife just texted me as soon as it started. All right. As Matthew McConaughey or McConaughey, it's one of those two. All right. As he would say, thank you guys for tuning in. For those of you that are, this is my first live stream, so if I screw things up, please have patience and mercy with me. All right. All right. So, sorry, my wife is still. Give me 1 second. All right. So, about a month ago, I made a video. Oh, hello. Hello, Baron1170. Thanks for tuning in. Yeah, so about a month ago, I made a video on John the Baptist and the resurrection. I'm going to go through what the argument is again. I'm going to kind of re-articulate it in case you haven't seen the video. But the context of this stream is that a couple apologists went ahead and made a response video. They did a live stream of their own about 2 weeks ago. They put forward what I think are probably the best arguments against my position that you can, and they're arguments that I've heard before. But in the end, I don't really think that they're very effective. So we'll go over that. But before we go over their video, again, I am going to kind of expound what my argument was, because I think it's an argument that I don't see used too often by, I don't see that argument used a whole lot by skeptics, and I don't know why, because I think it's a very, very effective argument in arguing against the resurrection. So the other thing, if we have time, the other thing that we might jump into is Inspiring Philosophy made a response video to a video of apologists, and while that has nothing to do with me or the video that I made, there is a snippet in there where they respond to basically the same argument I'm making with regards to John the Baptist. And so their comments are kind of relevant to the argument I'm making here. So if we have time, we'll jump into that. But primarily this stream is just to respond to, again, the two Christian apologists. And we'll look at their channels in just a little bit, but to respond to them. So before we do that, again, I just want to re-articulate my argument in case you missed the video, the original video on John the Baptist. So let me throw up some slides. And I don't know why, but these slides part of them are cut off. So yeah, so be patient with me. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into what is the argument I was making in the video. What do I think is the good argument to make against the resurrection based on John the Baptist and his ministry? And again, we're just going off of what's recorded in the Gospels. Remember that apologists tend to think, especially if they're a maximal case apologist, that what we see in the Gospels are generally reliable and go back to the eyewitnesses. And so if that's the case, we want to take what it says in the Gospels and go ahead and use that to our advantage. All right, let me get a drink of water. All right, I was flipping out because it says I've only been live 18 seconds, but that can't be right. All right, sorry. Okay, so yeah, I apologize for these slides. They're cut off. Some of them are cut off, but so let's take a look at the relevant verses. So in the Gospels, right, John the Baptist is beheaded. We don't really need to talk about why right now, but he's beheaded, right, by King Herod. And in Mark chapter 6, verses 14 through 16, we see the following statement. It says, King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying, John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work in him. But others said, it is Elijah. And others said, it is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. Yes, exactly. Zombie John the Baptist. So what we see here clearly is King Herod heard about what was going on with Jesus. Jesus's name had become known. And some people were saying that, so it's going to be really important here that we try to determine what exactly was being claimed about John the Baptist, right? Was he claimed to actually to have been resurrected, or was he like reincarnated in Jesus's ministry? I actually don't, my mom is watching the stream and she said, hi. Hi. Yeah, so sorry. So it's not exactly clear what King Herod was claiming about Jesus, whether or not he was claiming that he was resurrected, whether or not he was just claiming that he was resuscitated, which would be strange because he was beheaded. So, how do you resuscitate someone who was beheaded? Or if he was like reincarnated in his ministry. But actually, what we're going to learn is that based on like my argument doesn't depend on necessarily any of those, like you don't have to assume any of those necessarily for the argument to be efficacious. um and then sorry, my slide is cut off on the bottom here, and so let me just get the correct slide because I want to read it correctly. This is what I'm saying. Please be patient. All right, so and then in Matthew chapter 16 verses 13 through 14, it states, "Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." So there are other verses. There's a verse in Luke. I think there's multiple verses in Luke. And then the verse in Mark is also mirrored in Matthew. And then this verse in Matthew, I think, is also mirrored in Mark. But I think we have like three independent attestations of what was going on here. So basically, people heard about Jesus's ministry, and they somehow inferred that this was John the Baptist, who previously had died and had now come back to life in some sense. Okay, so again, I don't, sorry, Chuck, I don't want to ignore your comments here. So yeah, zombie John the Baptist, and after being decapitated, Saint Dennis's corpse stood up. I did not know that. Year 250. I'll have to look that up. Yeah, that's interesting because for me, what you're going to see is that the apologists try to make a claim that there's a difference between resuscitation and resurrection. And I don't really think that that's important for my case here. You could actually go with either one, and I think my case will still be strong. Minor God said, "I just read this scripture and was wondering how to pronounce Caesarea." I'm not 100% sure that I'm pronouncing it correctly, but I think that's how it's pronounced, Caesarea. So let's just assume that I'm pronouncing it correctly. By the way, guys, let me know if hopefully you can hear me well. It seems like you can. Again, this is my first time streaming, so hopefully you can hear me. I'm going to be playing videos later, so hopefully the audio on those is good. Yeah, Chuck says his severed head continued to preach the gospel. Yeah, I had not heard that, so I'll have to look that up because that is interesting and it's relevant to what we're talking about here. So, all right, let me go to my next slide so this is where I actually make my argument. I wish I would have made it more systematically in my video because it's a dilemma. So I think I should have actually, thanks, Minor Gods. I should have actually put like a systematized or systematic dilemma on the screen when I said it, because I do think it is a genuine dilemma. So here's the dilemma, and this one is not cut off. So here's the dilemma for the apologist, okay? And I do think that this is, I think that this is a very effective dilemma, and it is a true dichotomy. So you do have to take one of the horns because one of them is just the negation of the other. So you do have to take, the apologist does have to take one of these horns. All right, so either number one, based on the verses that we've seen, either number one, the threshold of evidence required for belief in a resurrection was so high that both the evidence for Jesus's resurrection and the evidence for John the Baptist's resurrection cleared it, or two, the threshold of evidence required for belief in a resurrection was so low that both the evidence for Jesus's resurrection and the evidence for John the Baptist's resurrection cleared it. Right. So here's the thing, like this is kind of, I think, putting the apologists in a corner here, because they're not going to want to affirm number one. Right. If you think that the threshold for believing in a resurrection for first century Jews was so high, then believing in John the Baptist's resurrection should not have cleared it, because all we have for John the Baptist is hearsay and rumors, right? If we go back to those verses, King Herod never saw Jesus preaching. He was just hearing stories about Jesus preaching. And I'm sure many other people as well were just hearing stories or rumors or hearsay about Jesus's ministry. So when they came to believe that he was John the Baptist back from the dead, this is not good evidence, right? But what we have here is we have evidence that first century Jews could easily believe that somebody who was previously dead had come back to life. So I really don't see why the apologists would want to take horn 1 or option 1. So it seems to me they would have to take option 2, which just and option 2 is really my argument, right? The threshold of evidence required for belief in a resurrection for first century Jews was just so low that they could come to believe almost anybody had resurrected from the dead. I mean, not anybody, but somebody like John the Baptist, where the evidence again was not high. So that's the argument in a nutshell. And so when we survey what the apologists are going to say in a little bit, they're going to make a lot of claims about, well, you need to differentiate between a resurrection and a resuscitation, but I really don't think you do. You can just reformulate this dilemma without even using the word resurrection. You could just say either the threshold of evidence required for believing that somebody who was previously dead was now alive was so high, and so on and so forth, right? So you can reformulate the dilemma no matter how the apologist wants to kind of play gymnastics, gymnastics with the words resurrection or resuscitation. It's really not a big deal. And so what I before we jump into the video, what's interesting is one of these apologists actually formulated my argument in 3 steps. And I'm thinking, like, I should have done that. I should have formulated my argument in 3 steps, because they actually did it very succinctly, which is interesting. They formulate my argument in 3 steps, but then later on they kind of they straw man it a little bit. But anyways, here was there. And again, I don't know why my slides are messed up. They weren't supposed to be like that. I have OCD when it comes to like presenting stuff like this. And anyways, so they're not supposed to be this messy. But anyways, this is actually the causal chain that the apologist formulated. And I changed it a little bit because I think the argument is a little bit better if I changed a couple things. But this is how we can formulate kind of a model of what can account for the resurrection based on what we know about John the Baptist. So sorry, let me just read Minor God's comment. So he says, not to mention all the resurrections in the Gospels. Yeah, Lazarus, Jairus' daughter. Yeah, like Hitchens used to say, based on all the resurrections or resuscitations in the New Testament, resurrection was almost like a banality. And again, yeah, apologists like to say, no, these weren't resurrections, these were resuscitations. But even if we accept that, which we can, I don't mind accepting that. But even if we accept that, I believe that the argument is still effective. So here's the causal chain, right? You have Jesus died. And then after Jesus died, you have the disciples experiencing profound trauma, cognitive dissonance, and then potential bereavement visions based on that psychological stress, which we know are common following the crucifixion. So now you have people that think that they've seen Jesus, right, through bereavement hallucinations or grief hallucinations. So then the next step in the causal chain is, because of John the Baptist, we know that first century Jews could easily believe that someone who was dead was now alive again, based on mere hearsay. So once you have the first step in place, which is that you have disciples who have some sort of vision or grief hallucination of Jesus, now that we know that it was easy for first century Jews to believe that someone who was previously dead was now alive, then it's easy to make that next logical step that they assume that Jesus had been resurrected from the dead. Now, again, the apologist is going to push back on this, but we'll see why it doesn't really work, right? It doesn't hold water. And then the next step would be, due to cognitive dissonance reduction coupled with social contagion, different types of sociological and psychological phenomena, and memory contamination, we now, eventually what's produced is the bodily resurrection narrative. And then somewhere in here, you have to account for the empty tomb. I know if an apologist is watching, they're like, what about the empty tomb? I didn't add that into the part of the causal chain, but it is an important part. We can account for that with tomb robbery, or that Joseph of Arimathea removed the body. I'm an adherent of James Fodor's RHBS model. We're not going to talk about that in this stream, but I think that the empty tomb can be accounted for and can be part of this causal chain. So, all right. So that's my argument in a nutshell, again, in case you missed my video on John the Baptist. So let's go ahead and let's get rid of this and let's jump into the video. All right, give me 1 second. All right, so this was live stream a couple weeks ago by two apologists. One of their names is Apollos, and the other's name is Roy. So Apollos, his channel is, I think, at like Apollos. Oh, it's right there at the bottom. Apollos Christian Apologetics, and then the other is Imago Logos. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And I've never heard of Imago Logos's channel. I had heard of Apollos. He's done like 3 responses to me, which I appreciate that he thinks I'm worthy of a response. But yeah, so both of these individuals went ahead and responded to my video. So that's what I'm going to respond to. We're not going to watch the whole video. Obviously, I have certain timestamps that we can look at. What I do want to say is that I believe Than Christophilus from Inspiring Philosophy, he was watching this. He was in the comment section talking about how bad my argument was. But no, I mean, he's a good dude, I think. But it was interesting to note that he had knowledge of my video. Also, when I had a debate with Eric Manning said that he had watched my video, which is nice. It's just nice to know that some of my videos are being shared in Christian apologetic circles. So, sorry, guys, give me 1 second. I'm actually going to play this because my wife just messaged me and I better get back to her. So I'm going to play this. Can you guys let me know if you can hear the audio?
Yeah, guys, I'm going to be carrying most of the stream because Roy was actually debating a metaphysics mic not that long ago. So
I had to get that video out quickly, so that's why I didn't have much time to prepare for this. I mean,
yeah, you're good.
The debate.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, could you describe just a little bit of what that debate was like?
It was pretty fun. So it ended with him crashing out and basically kicking me. So he conceded that the Trinity, or at least the model that I gave, doesn't entail any contradictions. But then he's like, oh, but if the Trinity is logical, then it's true. I was like, no, that's not what logical means. And then when
Sorry, guys. Can you hear the audio? Can somebody just let me know in the chat that they can hear it? Again, this is my first time streaming, so it said it's not a good idea to stream this like from a to just stream this from a window. So I want to make sure that you guys can hear, but I'm not getting anything. Let me see. Were you guys able to hear the video? Sorry, I'm not getting any comments. I just want to make sure I'm not playing a video into the void here. Someone give me the thumbs up, please. Please believe me. I hope everything's going all right because I'm not getting any comments from anybody. All right, I guess if you guys can't hear it, let me know. I'm a little worried that no one's, yeah. Oh, sorry. Well, it's because I already played it, so it was playing. So I was wondering if you guys heard it. So I'll play it again.
I tried to send it to him at the end. He just kicked me.
Nice. Well, yeah, today I was presenting at a mystery EPS regional conference. So I think it went well. I was able to handle most of the questions and
okay, thank you.
Comments towards my page.
Thanks, Chuck. Sorry, I guess what people were thinking was I was playing the video while I was talking. I apologize. So thank you guys. Okay, so let's go to our first timestamp, which is 2:22, which is almost right where I am. So they're going to start off just covering the context of my video. I do think that they, I do think that for the most part they are. They represent it charitably. I don't think that they strawman me a ton, but I think in a couple cases they do. But nevertheless, so they're going to start off just kind of characterizing my argument and kind of their initial thoughts regarding it.
Paper. Hopefully it gets published one of these days. But yeah, that was basically my last 2 days. Like you, I didn't prepare super much for this video that we're going to be reacting to. And for context, guys, it's going to be a skeptical agnostics, how John the Baptist refutes Jesus' resurrection. But yeah, I have some notes that I think dismantle pretty much his argument. And yeah, like I guess we can go over like our general like comments about the video. So I'll start right off. I think that he makes like several categorical errors to motivate his analogy, and once we expose those categorical errors, the analogy kind of falls apart. But what do you have to say about it, Roy? About like the summary of like the argument?
I think the argument is going to have to involve some form of a non sequitur, especially given the There's also like an equivocation done kind of on resurrection, because the claim, from what I know, isn't that John the Baptist was resurrected, but rather he was resuscitated, and that's going to come important when it comes to like. So, like, I guess you could say the context of this is that certain like scholars or apologists, maybe you want to point to someone like N.T. Wright, claimed that like the resurrection was unparalleled in the ancient world, and then they use this as like a piece of data to support the resurrection being true. And so this is one of the responses. But if this isn't really like a resurrection even being talked about, then, but if this isn't really a resurrection, because what people like Wright are talking about when they talk about resurrection is like its own unique category, and I think we're going to get into that later.
Yeah, 100%. We're going to get right into that.
We're going to get right into that. All right. So, hey, Juan, I see Modern Atheism. Go subscribe to his channel if you have not. Yeah, good to see you. Yeah, so notice, I mean, they haven't really gotten into the argument yet, but they already started articulating kind of what I told you they would, which is there's a difference between resurrection and resuscitation. Apollos calls this a category error. So as I articulated in my beginning slides, honestly, I think the argument works either way. Like, even if you want to think of what happened to John the Baptist as just a resuscitation, which again, it's kind of weird to categorize John the Baptist's coming back to life as merely a resuscitation, because he would need to have his head reattached, right? If it was a mere, like if he was just raised from the dead, like Jesus raised Lazarus, someone would have had to put John the Baptist's head back on, right? So I don't even think a resuscitation necessarily is that plausible here. I think we can go with resurrection, but nevertheless, like, my argument doesn't hinge on the difference between resurrection, or it doesn't hinge on a conflation of resuscitation with resurrection. As I said with my dilemma that we went over at the beginning, the dilemma still works even if we just say that these people believe that somebody who was previously dead had now come back to life. So I think, as we're going to see throughout this video, the arguments that they try to make, a lot of them are predicated on this distinction, claiming that I'm making a categorical distinction between resurrection and resuscitation. And I just think, like, sociologically, it doesn't make a big difference. It really doesn't. All right. So, and then one other thing I wanted to add is the text, and we're going to see this later. We're actually going to go through the Greek. That is my first super chat. Juan, thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it. So let me highlight. He says, "Is this your first super chat?" This is my first live stream, so that is my first super chat. I appreciate it, bud. You're helping me out here. I appreciate it. So thank you. Okay, so sorry, what was I gonna say? Juan's money distracted me. I was gonna say we're gonna get into the Greek in a little bit. Because they're going to make the case that the Greek doesn't demonstrate that what was being talked about with regards to John was a resurrection. And even if that's true, my argument is still effective. It's not a big deal, but I don't even think the text is clear regarding whether or not we're talking about a resuscitation or a resurrection. So, okay, let's jump into the next timestamp, which is 6:59. And I don't have YouTube Premium, guys, because I guess I'm cheap. So at some point we might be subjected to an ad, and we'll all watch the ad together and not buy whatever they're selling us together. All right. So here's the next timestamp.
Video. So first off, I just want to point out that the purpose of this video is not to dunk on skeptical agnostic too many times, even though I kind of have done that in the past before. I think he's a charitable interlocutor. Let's see, Haven, UNR IP server. Let's swap some notes. I hold to similar dating.
I think that's something else.
Yeah, that's an in-house discussion.
I think what he's kind of trying to say is that, from what I can tell, like, is this going to be an undercutting defeater or a rebutting defeater? Because from my interpretation, like, I've seen this argument before, typically it's taken as an undercutting defeater, which is an issue because kind of the way that it's framed now is that it's a rebutting defeater. So I don't know. It seems like a shift from how it's used typically.
Yeah, and
All right, so that's an interesting point made by Roy. He's talking about epistemology here, right? Is my argument against Jesus's resurrection, is it an undercutting defeater or is it a rebutting defeater? It's what would be called an undercutting defeater, meaning it's just used to kind of undercut the justification made for a proposition. So my claim is that, like, if my argument is cogent, it would, at best, it would give us a reason to view belief in the resurrection as irrational and unjustified. I don't claim that what I'm explicating with regards to John the Baptist just like completely refutes the resurrection. That's not what I'm claiming. But what I am claiming is that if we take this into account, it makes belief in the resurrection much more unreasonable and much more unjustified. It also just adds to our background knowledge, right? Even if we don't think that this argument is efficacious on its own, it adds to our background knowledge, meaning that it tells us that first century Jews could easily come to believe that somebody who had died had now been raised, even if you don't want to view this as a quote unquote resurrection, but if you just want to view it as a resuscitation, it adds to our background knowledge, and it just makes it makes our prior probability regarding the proposition that Jesus rose from the dead even lower. So that was a good question by Roy. Clearly he knows his epistemology really well. So yeah, I would say it's not a rebutting defeater, it's an undercutting defeater, and it adds to our background knowledge, which makes the prior probability of the resurrection even lower than I think it would already be. So, all righty. So let's keep going. I think this next point that Apollos is going to make is really, really important. I don't think he's making a good point, but I think the point that he's making demonstrates that in some sense he's not completely understanding my argument. So let's keep going.
Like I said, I think that what he does get right is that, a lot of like the same audience for John the Baptist was like eventually became disciples of Jesus of Nazareth. And they use a lot of like similar verbiage when it comes to like their teachings, their apocalyptic teachings, quote unquote. And like I said, I think there are a lot of categorical mistakes made when it comes to showing an apparent analogous relationship. Among these are things like, it really comes across as like an afterthought or rumor, not a strong belief when it comes to identifying Jesus as John the Baptist raised from the dead.
Okay, so this next point he's about to make, I think, is really important. And really quick, Juan said, I don't think you are trying to refute the resurrection. You are refuting one argument for the resurrection. Are they confusing both things? Yeah, and maybe it was my fault that I didn't clearly articulate how this is an argument. And it's because part of it is in the intro, of course, I'm being hyperbolic. And I say, like, this is devastating for the resurrection. Of course, I'm being a little bit hyperbolic, right? But yeah, so I think they were just confusing exactly how my argument was being presented or being geared towards. And maybe that was my fault. Maybe I didn't promote it as systemically as I should have. But nevertheless, so this next clip or this next statement from Apollos, I think, is really important.
And particularly, they're grounding it not because they actually saw John the Baptist raised from the dead, but because, like, as the text says, the powers are at work with Jesus. And we'll go more into detail about what this really means, but
okay, so notice what he said. He said the belief that John the Baptist was now alive again was grounded not from anybody actually seeing John the Baptist being raised from the dead. That's crucial. Exactly. That's exactly the point. People came to believe that somebody who was previously dead was now alive again, and they didn't even see the person, right? Like that's devastating. In my opinion, that's devastating for any justification or any rational belief one might have in coming to believe in the resurrection, because we're just talking about sociology here. We're saying that it was very easy for a first century Jew to come to believe that somebody who had died was now alive again, right? And again, all the talk about, well, this would have been a resuscitation and not a resurrection, that's irrelevant, because, and we're going to talk later about why it's irrelevant, but just to kind of demonstrate it really quickly, the reason why it's irrelevant is because all we need to do is look at the disciples and know that they were in an apocalyptic worldview. So they could take what might have been a resuscitation, or what might have normally been understood as a resuscitation, but in their apocalyptic worldview, they interpreted it as an end of the world resurrection. That's not a difficult leap to make. So yeah, I mean, I think Apollos is making my case for me here. Again, what he said was the belief that John the Baptist was now alive again was not grounded from anybody seeing John the Baptist. Yes, that's the point, right? Somebody could come to believe that somebody had been raised from the dead, and all they needed to believe that was hearsay and rumors. They didn't actually need to look and point and say, look, I see John the Baptist, there he is. So again, this just demonstrates that there was a low epistemic threshold in antiquity or in first century Palestine to come to believe that somebody had been raised from the dead. So I thank you, Apollos, for making my point for me. All right. And then let's jump to, I was going to jump to this timestamp because here Apollos, so if you were here at the beginning of the stream, I took this slide of his and I made my own because I do think that he, for the most part, accurately represented my argument here, but I just kind of tweaked, things here and there. Really quick, worship, everyone is gullible except our cult. Yeah, I mean, that's that's a good point. And apologists, like, you know, whenever I bring up that, and let me just highlight his comment because I think that that's a good comment here. So he said, yeah, everyone is gullible except our cult. And when you're talking to apologists, and I usually say, look, people in first century were superstitious, they were extremely gullible. And a lot of times they'll concede that because I can bring up countless examples. Trust me, I can bring up so many. It might even be the subject of one of my upcoming videos, just how superstitious and gullible first century, not even just first century Jews, but pretty much everyone was in the first century. Even the most learned scholars like Josephus and Herodotus and Plutarch, they were all very gullible and superstitious. But when you bring this up, apologists will say, well, yeah, they were, but they weren't that gullible. And then they'll point out a verse from the nativity narratives where it says that, you know, Joseph, I don't remember if it's Joseph or Mary, but they're saying, hey, people are going to think something's up because I'm pregnant and they know that I haven't been with a man, as if like, see, they weren't that gullible. They wouldn't just believe that somebody was pregnant without having had relations with a man. And to me, it's like, okay, even if I grant that, you're just saying, oh, they weren't gullible in this instance, but that doesn't mean that in general, they weren't very superstitious and very gullible. But yeah, it's a good point. Like, I think the skeptic will just say, yeah, they were all superstitious, they were all gullible. But for the apologist, they have to say, well, no, the people who inferred John the Baptist raised from the dead might have been gullible, but the disciples weren't. So good point. And then Grays said, do you think that there are actual people in history who thought John the Baptist rose from the dead? Well, yeah, absolutely. I think that's what the Gospels show us. Again, whether or not this was a resuscitation or a resurrection, we can debate that. But absolutely, I mean, and the point is, we don't need to believe that. We just need to, we're taking the Gospels at their word. And the point is, if we take the Gospels at their word, this is what we get. So I'm sure some people know, but there's still a John the Baptist sect alive today. They're called the Mandaeans. I don't think that they believe John the Baptist resurrected, but even the fact that they're still around is a very interesting piece of sociology, in my opinion. But all right, thank you guys for that. So yeah, here he presents my argument. I'm not going to play anything because I already went over the argument at the beginning, but I did think here that Apollos did adequately represent my position, which is interesting because it's weird that he's able to correctly represent my argument here, but then later on they kind of strawman it a little bit, or they misinterpret it. And I'm not accusing them of intentionally misrepresenting my argument, but here they correctly represent it. And then at the bottom, notice it says the skeptic's ultimate conclusion: if a dead prophet can be resurrected by mere rumor, the apostolic claim requires no supernatural explanation. And I would agree with that. I would agree with that. Okay, so let's go to the next timestamp, which is 12:04. I think we'll go right there. All right.
All right, we'll stop it right there. Any thoughts on that immediately, Roy?
Yeah, this kind of gets into what they're talking about with resuscitation and resurrection. Though, like, this is something that, if I remember correctly, Wright does mention that there's examples of resuscitation or just reviving someone from the dead. But resurrection is its own category within, like, the Second Temple Jewish mindset. And that's what we were really concerned about when it comes to Jesus.
Okay, so once again, notice they're making the argument. They're making the argument based off of the distinction between resurrection and resuscitation. Again, this is like a sociological point. It's not crucial to my argument. If you were here at the beginning, I put up a slide which is the dilemma. And in fact, let me just put it up again, just so we can see. So again, here was my dilemma at the beginning, okay? Either number one, the threshold of evidence required for belief in a resurrection was so high that both the evidence for Jesus's resurrection and the evidence for John the Baptist's resurrection cleared it. Or number two, the threshold of evidence required for belief in a resurrection was so low that both the evidence for Jesus's resurrection and the evidence for John the Baptist's resurrection cleared it. Now, again, this is a true dichotomy. One of these is the negation of the other. So, the apologist does have to pick one of these, and I don't think they would want to pick number one, right? Because then they're saying that the threshold was so high, and yet people still came to believe in John the Baptist's resurrection. But again, the point that Roy and Apollos are making is that my dilemma here is based on resurrection and not resuscitation. And again, at the beginning of this stream, I said, no, you can just reformulate the dilemma. And instead of using the word resurrection, we can just reformulate it and say the threshold of evidence required for believing that someone who was previously dead was now alive was so high that so on and so forth. So this distinction is not detrimental to my argument whatsoever. And again, we can easily account for the way that John the Baptist, if we assume John the Baptist was assumed to be resuscitated, but Jesus was assumed to be resurrected, we can easily account for that by the fact that Jesus had an apocalyptic ministry and his disciples were part of that apocalyptic ministry. And so they could have interpreted his resuscitation as an end of times resurrection. We can just make that leap through sociology and psychology. There's no big deal here. So this category error that they keep accusing me of is not detrimental to my argument. We can just reformulate the argument, and instead of using the word resurrection, we can just talk about someone who was previously dead, had now been, or was now believed to be alive. So sorry guys, there's a lot of comments coming in. I'm trying to keep up with them. I apologize. Juan said, I also have a list of legends with alleged eyewitness testimony saved somewhere, even historians like Suetonius and Herodotus. Yeah, I think I have that coming up on a video of mine. I mean, even Herodotus, he's called the father of modern history. No, the father of modern history, or the father of history? I don't know. I mean, he wasn't that modern. But anyways, yeah, he's called the father. Let's just call him the father of history. So he's called the father of history, and yet he records some of the most ridiculous things, because that's just, and some of them he distances himself from, but some of them he doesn't. And then look at somebody like Josephus, who, what was a contemporary for the most part of like disciples of Jesus. And he records some things that he explicitly says, I almost wouldn't have believed this if it weren't for eyewitness testimony. So yeah, I mean, even if we grant eyewitness testimony here, there's nothing that, pushes us in the category that these are sober-minded, non-gullible sources or people. So thanks for that, Juan. Oh yeah, thanks, Grace. He's clarifying. I don't have any reason to think that the story in Gospels is accurate, but the story being made up is still fine to prove. Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Like, even if we assume, like, we're just assuming the material that the apologist is assuming. We're assuming that the Gospels are somewhat reliable to what the disciples believed and what they encountered. So yeah, that works. And then Chuck said, sorry, Chuck, I'm trying to find where you started that thought. I think Chuck said it was illegal to question anything about the resurrection. Oh, in the Middle Ages, it would have been illegal to refute the resurrection. I'm sure it would have. I'm sure it would have. Doesn't surprise me at all. All right, so let's now there. So now now Roy and Apollos are going to jump into the Greek. Now I don't know Greek, so and I don't know if they do, but I still think that the point that they're going to make here is not. It's really not. Doesn't do much for their argument. Sorry, guys. I just realized I was not showing the video. Sorry, I apologize. This is what happens when you don't know what the hell you're doing. I apologize. Let's try it again. I'm sure you guys could hear it, but yeah, sorry. Let's try it again.
Which is uniquely, by and large, unique, almost exclusively in reference to a bodily or physical resurrection, namely within the Pharisaical understanding of the resurrection as a corporate, basically raising of the dead in physical immortal form. That's different from agero, over the word used for John the Baptist on the right, which can mean physical resurrection, but it has a broader semantic range to include things like even things like waking up from sleep or just getting up in general, restore to health, spiritual resurrection. And you can find references to these definitions in BDAG, Liddell Scott, plenty of like New Testament Greek lexicons, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so yeah, Gray's asked if we're having a boomer tech moment. I'm not a boomer, but yes, we are. That's exactly what we're. So I apologize. Okay, so I mean, granted, this is does it the first? So Gray's said that's a good point. I didn't even think to look at that. Gray's said the 1 Corinthians 15 creed uses agero. That's interesting. What we're going to see is I do have slides prepared of verses that do speak of Jesus's resurrection using agero. And granted, Apollos did grant that. But the point here, again, the point here is even if his point is completely is correct, it doesn't really affect my argument. If we still want to characterize John the Baptist, what was understood of John the Baptist was just a resuscitation, which again, I don't understand how that is, because you'd have to assume that his head was put back on his body. But even then, even if we assume that, my argument is still pretty effective, I think, right? I don't think that this is a point against it. But so yeah, his point is with resurrection, when we speak of like an end times resurrection, anastasis was used. And when we're talking about resuscitation, most of the time, agero is used. That's fine, but it's not clear because, again, in the New Testament, we do use agero is used to speak of Jesus's resurrection. So Gray's just pointed that out in his comment here, and I do have some slides. So we'll do these really quick. And again, I'm sorry if they're cut off. I don't know why some of these slides are being cut off. Okay, this one's not. So these are verses where agero is used. So Matthew 16:21, from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. So here we're talking about Jesus's resurrection, and yet they use the word agero. And then Matthew 17:9, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Again, for this one, what is used is agero, not anastasis, and we're talking about resurrection here. And then Mark 16:6, but he said to them, do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth. So this is the angel speaking. So do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. Egero, he is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. And then Luke, and these are just 4 that I pulled, but there's a bunch of other ones. I just didn't want to belabor the point. So Luke 24:33 through 34. That same hour, they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, the Lord has risen. Again, that's Egero. The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon. So the point here is that you could use Egero to refer to resurrection. So just the fact that Egero is used in the cases of John the Baptist does not make it clear that we're not referring to a resurrection. This is not a point in either favor, in my opinion. This is not a point in favor of the apologists, and it's not a point in favor of my position. We just have to say it's not clear. It's not clear whether or not a resuscitation or a resurrection is being referred to in the cases of John the Baptist, because in certain cases in Scripture, and again, Gray's just pointed out it's in 1 Corinthians 15:2, Egero, which might be taken to be a resuscitation, was also used to refer to a resurrection. Now, Apollos, he did grant this point, so then I don't really know why he was making such a big point of the Greek. So again, what we have here is just we're at a stalemate here with regards to the Greek. Okay. This time I'm going to remember to go back to the video, so we're not having a boomer moment. All right, so let's keep going. Let's see. Where are we next? Okay, 14:17. And sorry, guys, I know that I'm playing their clips and I'm not playing my clips from the video. So I know sometimes the context might not be clear, but there's no point in playing the clips of my own video, because you can go and watch my own video if you want. So I'm just trying to play their clips, but hopefully the context is not lost. All right.
And we'll get into that soon here in a bit. But yeah, like the taxonomy of the ancient afterlife, it was Herod the Great. No, sorry, not Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, who basically entertained this idea, according to Mark 6, that it was some sort of like a transmigration of the souls from John the Baptist into Jesus. And so, like, there's no understanding that it's radically different from Jesus' resurrection. One where there's anastasis, one where Jesus is raised immortally, and without corruption, and initiates the kingdom of God and things like that. Spiritual successor.
Okay, so this is interesting. I find this interesting because Apollos is kind of pivoting from what Roy was saying. So Roy was saying, well, what we have described of John the Baptist here is a resuscitation. And now Apollos is saying not even that. He's saying that the John the Baptist case can be placed into like a ghost category, that they were viewing John the Baptist as returning as a ghost. But there's nothing in the text that demonstrates that. Again, it clearly says that John the Baptist was raised from the dead. That does not elicit any type of idea of a ghost or a spirit. So I really think his taxonomy here might be completely correct, but I don't like. So his taxonomy is probably correct, but I don't know why he's not putting the John the Baptist case in the resurrection. So I think he's the one making a category mistake here. But and then also he's pivoting from what Roy was saying earlier. Roy was trying to make the distinction between resuscitation and resurrection, and now he's essentially trying to argue that John the Baptist was seen as a spirit. Again, even if we want to go that far, I still think, even if I grant him all this, I still think that my argument can get off the ground. Even if we want to say that John the Baptist was seen as a spirit coming back, we could still assume that maybe the early Christians originally thought that about Jesus, but then when they incorporated that into their millenarian apocalyptic worldview, they made that into a resurrection. It's not hard to make that stretch either. Like, again, this is just common sociology from first century Judaism. It's not difficult to make that leap. And again, I'm granting Apollos everything he wants me to grant him here. And still, I think that the argument is efficacious. But again, I think he's making a really bad conflation here, because I think at best you should, or at worst, not at best, at worst, you should put John the Baptist's, the belief in John the Baptist as being raised from the dead as a resuscitation. But nevertheless, okay. Let's move on to, and by the way, they don't spend this whole video covering my video. So we're actually almost done with their videos, kind of. But I think they stopped covering my video somewhere around here, and they talk about other stuff. So apparently I was not amusing for them for their whole video. So let's go to 1642.
The general rumors of the crowd. You wanted to say something, Roy?
Even if, let's say, Herod thought that that John the Baptist was like physically resuscitated from the dead, right? I'm not really sure why that would pose a defeater for the resurrection, because the conditions that would lead to Herod's belief are completely different from the conditions that lead to the disciples' beliefs, because the disciples' beliefs are going to be caused by like direct experience with Jesus and the experience of seeing him risen from the dead. Whereas with Herod, there's no implication of that. So there's a clear symmetry breaker between the two.
So first off, Roy's point here assumes that the Gospels are true. Now, maybe he's a maximal facts guy, and that's fine. Like, I think my argument can still be, make headway with the maximalist case. But I mean, he's assuming that what we read in the Gospels is true. He's saying, like, well, the case of John the Baptist is different than the case of Jesus, because in the case of Jesus, they actually like saw Jesus and touched him and interacted with him. But that's just begging the question, right? My point is that the initial spark, one of the initial catalysts, could be the same initial spark or initial catalyst when people came to believe that John the Baptist was raised from the dead. Rumor and hearsay, right? Or we could have a hallucination of Jesus, right? And again, it was just easy, even from a hallucination, it would just have been easy for them to then come to the conclusion that Jesus had been raised from the dead. So this is like a hypothesis, on my view, a hypothesis of some legendary development can easily account for this. And it just seems like Roy is assuming that, so he's calling this an asymmetry between John the Baptist and Jesus. And I agree that they're not completely symmetrical. But again, I don't think that that's an issue. As if we leave the door open for legendary development, which the door should be open there, because we're talking about Gospels that were written decades after whatever the initial spark was. So to claim that over 40 years, there wasn't some legendary development and the spark couldn't have been started by something like what we see with John the Baptist, to me is just, it's incredulous. I don't think that there's a good point to be made there. So, all right, let's jump to the next one. 2240. All right.
Towards that.
Right, but with the disciples, that's not going to be the case. So that's kind of why we're saying that there's two different sets of like conditions that lead to these beliefs. So there's one set of conditions that lead to the belief that like John the Baptist was resuscitated, but then there's a completely different set of conditions that lead to the belief that Jesus was risen from the dead. And when it comes to the second set of conditions, that set of conditions is sufficient for having a rational belief, because the type of conditions going on there is that the disciples are having like multimodal experiences of Jesus after his death and resurrection. Whereas with the former, it's based off of paranoia.
So again, Roy here's he's just really begging the question. He's assuming that the accounts in the Gospels are true. He's assuming that people saw Jesus, that they touched him, that he ate with them, right? The maximal case apologists like to make a big deal of this multimodal. So he's saying there was a different set of conditions that was the catalyst for belief in John the Baptist as being raised from the dead. And there was another set of conditions that was the catalyst for believing Jesus rose from the dead. So I can even grant that, but again, I think Roy is begging the question here to assume that the set of conditions that led to Jesus's resurrection was actually seeing him, interacting with him, touching him. That's just blatant begging the question. What we've seen, again, based on my dilemma, is that people in first century Palestine could easily come to believe that somebody who was previously dead was now alive. So we can posit that as a catalyst and then posit the rest as legendary development and sociological and psychological conditions that cause people to believe or develop through legend these stories. So, I mean, unless we just assume the Gospels are correct from the get-go, I don't think Roy's point is good at all, right? He's saying that our different set of conditions, the different sets of conditions are based on assuming that the Gospels are reliable. Now, obviously, we can have a discussion about the reliability of the Gospels, but this is just blatant question begging, in my opinion. So, all right, let's move on. 2707. And some of the time here, they're answering their own comments and super chats, so that's why I'm skipping over some of this. All right.
That correspond to that belief. So yeah, like he says that fanciful hearsay can generate sincere belief, and I think that's a non sequitur. Or fanciful hearsay necessarily generates sincere belief. I think that's a non sequitur. Because like you see, like,
I was gonna say, even if we granted that in some sense, like some, I guess.
Sorry, let me play that again, because I wanted to stop it at a certain point and I did not. So let's try that again.
That correspond to that belief. So yeah, like he says that fanciful hearsay can generate sincere belief, and I think that's a non sequitur. Or fanciful hearsay necessarily generates sincere belief. I think that's a non sequitur.
So, okay, so he mischaracterizes my position here. I never claimed that fanciful hearsay necessarily generates sincere belief. That's a ridiculous position, right? Because all you would have to do is find one case where fanciful hearsay does not generate sincere belief. So I never claimed that fanciful hearsay necessarily generates belief. My position is that sometimes it does. Sometimes fanciful hearsay generates sincere belief. Who would argue against that? I don't know that anyone would argue against the claim that sometimes fanciful hearsay generates sincere belief. And that's all that my argument needs to get off the ground, right? Just saying that fanciful hearsay in one case in first century Palestine convinced a group of Jews and Herod that somebody who was previously dead had now come back to life. That's all my argument needs to get off the ground. And it doesn't need, it's weird that he's characterizing this as a connection of necessity. That's just not true at all. All right, let's keep going here.
Because like you see, like,
I was gonna say, even if we granted that in some sense, like some, I guess you could say, hearsay can generate like actual belief of a resuscitation, that like that claim, that conditional, isn't going to entail anything about the resurrection. Because saying that fanciful hearsay can generate the sincere belief isn't going to tell us whether it actually did, and it's not going to tell us anything about the
whether it likely did.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I had to catch myself there. Yeah,
like in some sense, sure, we can like concede that very like specific conditional, but that conditional has no other entailments that are relevant to like the topic.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting to me. Once you grant, again, that hearsay and rumors can generate an actual belief in a resuscitation, Roy seems to think that this has no entailments for the resurrection that are relevant to the that's absolutely ridiculous. Of course it does. Once we admit that hearsay is capable of generating belief that someone previously dead is now alive in first century Palestine, you've admitted that the threshold for believing such a thing was incredibly low. How could you not think that this is directly relevant to the resurrection? It means that it could have been the case that the threshold was also low for the disciples to come to believe that Jesus had resurrected from the dead. Again, this goes back to my dilemma. right? My dilemma that I presented, I already presented it twice, so hopefully you guys remember it. But once you open the door to granting that hearsay can generate actual belief in a resuscitation, or that somebody who was previously dead is now alive, I mean, I don't understand how you think that this is not relevant to the resurrection. This is absolutely relevant to the resurrection. We're talking about first century Jews in Palestine who we now already know could come to believe that somebody who was previously dead was now alive. That's the argument. That's the argument. And I don't understand, unless you just assume that the Gospels are true through and through, I don't understand how somebody can assume that this is not relevant to the resurrection of Jesus. It absolutely is, and it adds to our background knowledge as well. Again, this adds to our background knowledge, and it should make the prior probability of believing that somebody in the first century had actually come back to life or had resurrected, it makes that prior probability even lower, right? So we can formulate an actual argument against the resurrection using it, and it adds to our background knowledge. Okay. So I just don't understand how, I was going to say with a straight face, Roy can say this, but he's not shown on video. So I don't know if he's saying it with a straight face, but I just don't understand how you can make that claim. I mean, it's clearly relevant. It's clearly relevant to the resurrection. All right. I think we only have two more clips. So thank you for bearing with me. I'm not big on doing super long streams. So I don't know. There's some people that do like 5-hour streams. I don't know how they do that. I don't have the stamina. Maybe I will at some point. I don't know. All right, here we go.
Let me explain why I'm going to cherry pick information.
I think he's making a joke, but yeah, I feel like this doesn't really hurt like a maximalist case. At most, this can go against, let's say, like a minimalist case, but I don't know. Even then, I feel like it doesn't really hurt it that much, because the argument that someone like Wright is making, or that Craig wants to make, is that a claim about resurrection is not going to be expected. Not just mere resuscitation, but rather resurrection from the disciples specifically. Like maybe Herod might have anticipated some resuscitation because of his paranoia, but what does that actually tell us about like the psychological state of the disciples? I don't really see why it would tell us anything.
So first off, they mentioned the maximalist case. Yeah, I mean, again, the maximalist case is different from the minimalist case, but I still think that my argument is effective against the maximalist case. I don't think that there's any issue here. I think any of the issues that they've articulated, I've demonstrated aren't anything to worry about. But then he says, Roy says, a claim of resurrection would not be expected among the disciples. Why not? Why would that not be expected? We have Jesus who, if the Gospels are correct, was constantly articulating that he was going to rise from the dead. Now, of course, the Gospels present the disciples as like they didn't really understand what was going on. But here's something interesting: is when you read Matthew. Matthew talks about how the Pharisees decided to put a guard at the tomb. And if you read the Gospels carefully, it's interesting why they say that a guard is placed at the tomb. A guard is placed at the tomb because they remember that Jesus said he would resurrect. And so they don't want the disciples to come take the body and say that he's been resurrected. So here's what's interesting. Even the Pharisees remembered and put a lot of emphasis on the fact that Jesus claimed he was going to be resurrected. So why would we also assume that a claim of resurrection would not be expected among the disciples? Why would we assume that? I mean, I think if there's any group in the first century that we would expect a claim of resurrection to be, it would be from the disciples. Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet. So part of that was not only did he believe that the end of the world was coming soon, but part of that is he believed that the general resurrection was going to come as well. So the disciples' worldview was probably swarming around resurrection, right? And for me, the claim that none of them, possibly, or none of them correctly interpreted Jesus as that he was going to resurrect again, to me, it's just not, it's not very likely. So a claim of resurrection would absolutely be expected among the disciples, because again, Jesus's movement was apocalyptic and eschatological. So sorry, some of you made some comments, so I do want to highlight those. What I've noticed about streaming is it's really hard to keep up with what I want to say, what I want to articulate, but then I also want to read your comments and highlight your comments And it's hard to do both of those at the same time. So I guess it's something I'll have to learn. Koopa says, I wish I knew more about the Mandaeans and what we know about John the Baptist's eschatology. Yeah, you know what? I haven't read James McGrath's book. I do want, and in fact, he came out with 2 books, which makes it harder. It's like, well, which one should I read? He came out with 2 books on John the Baptist and the Mandaeans. So I haven't read those. I do want to, but yeah, same. I mean, I wish we knew more about them. I mean, it's very interesting that we still have a John the Baptist sect alive today, because not constantly, but every now and then I hear an apologist say, you know, and these are apologists that aren't very good, just to be honest, not Roy and Apollos. I'm talking about other apologists that claim, well, one of the reasons we know Christianity is true is because it's still around today, which is, I think, a horrible argument. But we can say, well, the Mandaeans are still around today, right? So what do you make of that? What do you make of that? Jake said, hi. Hello, Jake. Good to see you. What is happening? I don't know, man. Resurrection stuff, John the Baptist stuff. So for those of you, if you came in late, what we're doing is these individuals, Apollos and Roy, are responding to the video I made about John the Baptist's resurrection and about how I think when we take the accounts of John the Baptist being believed to have come back from the dead, it formulates a very good argument against the resurrection, in my opinion. So that's what's going on. And then Warship says, every resurrection myth is impossible since people can't resurrect, but Jesus resurrected because we have true faith. Yeah, I mean, you know what's interesting is once I started losing my faith, resurrection was one of the first things to go, because I realized that, excuse me, I realized that it was not on firm footing. So I held on to my faith. Like, I gave up belief in a literal resurrection, and I still held on to my faith for maybe a year and a half or 2 years after that, just not believing that there was good. Like, I believed it by faith, but I didn't believe that there was good historical argumentation or evidence for it. That was one of the first beliefs to go, because I was starting to be more honest with myself, and I had to look at the evidence and say, like, yeah, this evidence is just not good. So anyways, but that's my own personal journey. And then Grace says, John the Baptist definitely had origins, spherical resurrection body, eschatology. I don't know what origins, spherical resurrection body, eschatology is. I'll have to look into that. So sorry for being ignorant of your point there. All right, we're almost done. We are almost there. Actually, this is our last clip. This is our last clip, everyone. So our last clip from this video. So let's see if I can get it right. Oh, did I switch? Okay, I'm good. I haven't even had slides up. So what do I know? Sorry, I'm trying to make sure you guys can see the video, because earlier I didn't have it on. Where were we? 35, 40, 35, 36 will do.
These resuscitations. So yeah, the rumor threshold, claiming a living miracle worker is empowered by a dead martyr's ghost, requires zero empirical evidence. It thrives on low threshold hearsay. Claiming an individual physically resurrected in the middle of history, leaving an empty tomb in the shadow of their execution site, requires a massive empirical catalyst. And so NT Wright's axiom still holds. So yeah, I at the end of the day, I think it's just like a mountain made out of a molehill trying to match a mountain of evidence. So yeah, that pretty much sums up most of it.
So really quick, I just want to go back to his graphic. So he has so this is interesting. Again, Apollos is still trying to pigeonhole now the belief in John the Baptist being resuscitated as like a ghost, right? So he says claiming a living miracle worker is empowered by a dead martyr's ghost. Again, that's not clear that that's what was being claimed. Like, I agree that there is some sense where it could be interpreted that Jesus was or that John the Baptist was like somehow reincarnated as Jesus. That might be the case, but that's not clear. It clearly says John the Baptist was raised from the dead. So I think for me, the two categories are resurrection or resuscitation. Claiming that John the Baptist was seen as this like ghostly spirit type figure is not what the text demonstrates at all. So automatically, I think he's being disingenuous here. But then he claims that it requires zero empirical evidence. Well, it might require zero empirical evidence, but the belief was catalyzed by rumor and hearsay. And the claim is that easily could have been the catalyst for Jesus's resurrection. We just don't know, right? That could have easily been the catalyst. So I think Apollos is being a little bit sneaky here. I'm not saying he's doing that intentionally. He seems like a good dude. But the other thing he said was, he talks about the middle of history. And this is just this. I hate when apologists say this, because I think that they're being sneaky. So I know some of you probably can't read this, but it says, claiming an individual physically resurrected in the middle of history, leaving an empty tomb, so on and so forth. So apologists like to say that the Jews did not expect someone to resurrect in the middle of history. I can agree with that, and yet we don't know that that's what the disciples assumed. Remember, the disciples, part of Jesus's close-knit group, they were apocalyptic, they were apocalyptic, they were millenarian, and they were eschatological, meaning they assumed that the end of the world was going to take place very soon. In fact, if you haven't watched the last video I just made about false prophecy, I recommend you watch that video, because it's quite clear that the early Christian church assumed that the general resurrection, the end of the world, the apocalypse, was right around the corner. They expected that the Son of Man, that Jesus, was going to ride on the clouds very soon. So to claim that Jesus's resurrection is not symmetrical with John the Baptist's resurrection, because Jesus's resurrection would have been seen as a, quote, middle of history resurrection, is disingenuous, right? We shouldn't assume that that's what the disciples would have believed. They would have believed that, had they, whatever catalyzed their belief that Jesus had been raised from the dead, they would have said, oh yeah, Jesus has been raised from the dead. We believe that the end of the world is about to happen. So this is the first fruits of the general resurrection. That's exactly what the Apostle Paul says, that Jesus's resurrection was the first fruits of the general resurrection. So Apollos is not painting this in a charitable light. Okay, and again, I'm not saying he's doing that intentionally. Apologists do that all the time. And at the bottom, he puts a quote by N.T. Wright, which my whole video was part of debunking this claim by N.T. Wright. So I don't know why he puts this quote again at the bottom of his slide, because my whole video debunks N.T. Wright's claim. And so N.T. Wright's axiom is, a vision of a dead person would not be taken by someone in the ancient world as evidence that the person was alive. It would be taken as evidence that the person was dead. The whole point of the video is, no, this is refuted by John the Baptist. Visions where people believed that they in some sense saw John the Baptist again raised from the dead, and it was not taken that John the Baptist was dead. They said John the Baptist, whom I beheaded, has now been raised from the dead. So N.T. Wright's axiom is false. That's the whole point of the video. All right, that's the whole point of the video. So yeah, I mean, look, here's the thing, right? Even if we believe that the disciples didn't originally believe Jesus was resurrected, but that they just believed he was resuscitated, once we couple this with an apocalyptic eschatology, which we know Jesus proclaimed and which we know the disciples also had, and then we can couple this with like social contagion, this is an easy and sufficient and adequate catalyst that would lead to the disciples believing that Jesus had been raised from the dead, using resurrection language. Okay, so yeah, I mean, that's it. They're done looking at my arguments from here. They start talking about other stuff. So yeah, I don't think that, let me remove this. Yeah, I don't think that anything they said actually calls my argument into question. Again, I presented the dilemma. I presented it twice in the stream. If you didn't see, nothing that they presented and nothing that they reviewed in my video refutes that dilemma. When it comes to that dilemma, they have to take one of the horns. And again, I'll just put it up one more time in case you're late to the party. So here was my dilemma. Again, either number one, the threshold of evidence required for belief in a resurrection was so high that both the evidence for Jesus's resurrection and the evidence for John the Baptist's resurrection cleared it, or number two, the threshold of evidence required for belief in a resurrection was so low. Okay, so again, I don't think apologists would take horn number one, right? Because their whole point is it didn't take it was just rumor and hearsay that accounted for the belief in John the Baptist being resuscitated. So I don't see why any apologist would take number one, and therefore they have to take number two. And that's my argument. We see then that the threshold, the epistemic threshold, right, whatever was required for a first century Jew to believe that someone who was previously dead had come back to life was extremely low. Once we grant that, the evidence for the resurrection, I think, is severely weakened. Severely weakened, right? And we're just talking about basic sociology and psychology here. And the Gospels themselves provide us evidence that allows us to doubt the resurrection of Jesus. Yeah, this is a really good point. Resurrection Nerd says, visions equal concluding that the person was dead. Okay, then how could Paul conclude Jesus was resurrected after his visions on the Damascus Road? That is a very good point, right? So Apollo and Roy were making the case that, or they were quoting N.T. Wright, that visions of the dead would convince, or excuse me, a vision of somebody that was dead would just convince them that the person was dead, not was alive. And that's also contradicted in Paul's account. So very good. All right. So I did want to cover, yeah, exactly. So he says it's a counterexample that refutes right. Yeah, absolutely. So good point there. So I did want to cover a video by Inspiring Philosophy, because he kind of makes a similar argument. And then I think we'll wrap up the stream. So in this video by Inspiring Philosophy, they're not responding to me. I wish they were. But they're responding to Apologia, because during one of Apologia's videos, he makes kind of the same case I'm making. He makes it very quickly. That's why I said, like, I don't think skeptics of the resurrection think about the case that can be made from John the Baptist enough. I think a very strong case can be made. That's why I made a video on it. But Inspiring Philosophy was responding to a point that Apologia made that's geared towards the same thing. And they, like, Mike Jones thinks that, like, this is some major point for the resurrection. It's really strange to me how he thinks that it's actually the opposite, that John the Baptist actually gives really good evidence that Jesus resurrected from the dead. It's, I don't know, it's very strange to me. So let me just, let me share that screen. Why can I not do it? Hold on, guys. This is, once again, this is me not knowing what the hell I'm doing. Oh, there we go. Where is it? Okay, here we go. All right, so this one starts at, so this one's about 3 minutes long. I'm gonna play the whole clip. And look, I'll be honest, like, I like Mike Jones. I like Than. I think Mike Jones can be a little heavy on the hyperbole and whatnot, but I think he's a nice dude, regardless of what you think. But I do think here that he kind of lays it on a little thick, and I think he, like, laughs and smirks and whatnot. And I really think that I don't understand. I mean, I do understand why he thinks that this is a good argument. Why he thinks that this is, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not even sharing the screen. I'm such an idiot. Okay. I understand why he thinks that this is somehow a good argument for the resurrection, but I think he's definitely wrong. So let me make sure the audio is up on that. It is not. Okay. So here we go.
Point. How does this help us explain why they thought Jesus rose from the dead? But the next clip we're going to play is an example of somebody shooting themselves in the foot and kind of demonstrating our points for us.
So really quick, he thinks that the John the Baptist point makes the skeptic shoot themselves in the foot, that this is actually a great point for the resurrection. Okay. All right.
Here.
Only the Christians said only Jesus was resurrected. The Christians didn't even use resurrection language to describe just dead saints. Like they weren't like John the Baptist also resurrected.
Well, that's the worst possible example you could have chosen. In
Really?
Mark 6:14 and Matthew 14:2, King Herod says of Jesus, "This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead. That is why miraculous powers are at work with him." Luke 9:7 reports that some were saying that John had been raised from the dead. The Bible sure thinks that some people were using this kind of language.
This is Okay, let's just talk about what just happened here. Where do I start? Okay, why was Herod claiming that John the Baptist had risen from the dead? Because someone was walking around physically doing miracles. He was like, hey, there's an actual guy out there walking around doing miracles. That must mean someone rose from the dead. Guess what didn't happen on Paul's hypothesis after Jesus died? Somebody walking around doing miracles. It was all hallucinations. The body was still in the tomb. So yes, if you see somebody walking around on 2 feet, it's like positing a resurrection makes sense. But all the skeptics want to tell us nobody was walking around after Jesus died.
Just felt
This
the
is
presence.
shooting. They just felt the presence. This is shooting yourselves in the foot. This is proving our point for us. Yes, if you saw somebody walking around, it makes sense to posit a resurrection. If you don't, it doesn't make sense. That's our point. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. Yes, they saw Jesus walking around. They assumed somebody came back from the dead. You don't think that happened when Jesus died, though. So why would they, by that logic, those same people would not have posited a resurrection for Jesus? Thank you. Argument conceded.
And then there's Michael's face. Okay. Sorry, let me hide this comment. Okay, so yeah, I get why Michael thinks this is a good argument, but at the same time, I don't get it. So he affirms that hearsay and rumors were enough to convince Jews that John the Baptist was raised from the dead, but he claims that the real catalyst was that Jesus was actually walking around, so that you actually need someone walking around in order to affirm the resurrection, or in order to affirm that that person was resurrected. Not necessarily, right? You could have a case of somebody just being mistaken. Think about this, right? During the Passover, there were tens of thousands of Jews cramped into a small space in Jerusalem. Right? So you could have had, in the case with Jesus, after Jesus died, you could have had an empty tomb, and then you could have had bereavement hallucinations, and then you could have had other people that think that they saw Jesus somewhere far off, because again, there were tens of thousands of people in Jerusalem. They all, I'm sure a lot of them looked very similar. And so it's not like you actually needed to see the actual Jesus in order for somebody to believe that he had come back from the dead. And so here's the thing about John the Baptist. Herod never saw Jesus. We never, again, we're talking about, if you look back at the gospel accounts, we're talking about rumors here, right? We're talking about people heard about what Jesus was doing. Herod heard about what Jesus was doing. Yes, there was an actual person, Jesus, but the point is he was not John the Baptist. And so somebody could come to believe that John the Baptist was raised from the dead merely from hearing rumors and hearsay, right? Yes, there was an actual, like, somebody was walking around, but if somebody could come to believe that somebody had been raised from the dead that was previously dead just from rumors and hearsay, it just demonstrates that the epistemic threshold was not high to believe that, right? So I don't understand why Michael thinks that this is, not only that this isn't a good argument for the skeptic, but how this is somehow flipped on its head and is somehow a good argument for the resurrection. Again, if we go back to the dilemma that I presented, what we can say is that people could mistakenly infer that someone who was previously dead was now alive again. Once we open the door to that, the catalyst required for the disciples to believe that Jesus was resurrected, the catalyst it doesn't need to be that great. It doesn't need to actually be Jesus physically walking around. It could be attributable to rumors, and it could be attributable to hearsay, coupled with bereavement hallucinations, coupled with possibly an empty tomb, coupled with an apocalyptic, millenarian, eschatological breeding ground. Okay, like it's not difficult to cook up a scenario where the disciples would come to believe that Jesus was resurrected, taking bits and pieces from what we see with John the Baptist and Herod and other Jews. So I don't understand how Inspiring Philosophy thinks that this is a good argument. So, all right. That's all I have for you today, guys. I am going to go over some of the comments. So someone said... I'm having trouble remembering where I left off. Oh, okay. So Bourbon says, have you heard of Tim and Lydia McGrew on the evidence for gospel authorship and Jesus's resurrection? And what do you think of their arguments? So I've watched videos by Lydia McGrew. I haven't read their article or their chapter in, I think it's the Blackwell Companion. I haven't read their chapter. I mean, I know that they push a maximalist case, so I'm familiar with apologists pushing a maximalist case. I still think so. I had a debate with Eric Manning. It's on my channel, and we only talked for about 35 minutes or so, and he pushes a maximalist case, and I put forward James Fodor's RHBS model. I think it's a great model. I would recommend you guys go check out James Fodor's channel. I know he's going to be on Myth Vision's channel soon. And what's interesting is I was actually kind of formulating my own model a few months ago that was very similar to James Fodor's model. And then I read James Fodor's book and his chapter on the resurrection. And I was like, oh, this is all the stuff that I had already been kind of putting together in my head. So it was interesting. So that's one of the reasons I affirm his model, is because I was already starting to come to a model like that on my own. And then so I found his arguments to be really convincing. But yeah, so sorry to answer your question. I haven't read any of their work, but I've watched videos of Lydia McGrew's, and I've encountered plenty of maximal case apologists. So I do think that, I mean, first off, I don't think traditional gospel authorship is very likely. And I don't think that arguing that the gospel accounts likely go back to eyewitness accounts is very likely either. But I do still think that you can make a good case against the resurrection, even assuming all that. And I do think that Fodor's model, his RHBS model, is sufficient or is adequate to rise to the challenge. It seems like some of these are comments geared towards addressing each other. So I'm just trying to find some. All right, Luke 9:8. Luke 9:8 also mentions the idea of the resurrection of an ancient prophet. So obviously, yeah. I mean that. So Luke 9:8, I think, also mentions Luke 9:8 or Luke 9:7 is also one of the John the Baptist verses. But then they also mention well, maybe we're talking about a prophet that has been raised from the dead. So yeah, I mean, this whole claim from N.T. Wright and William Lane Craig that there's just no precedent for a resurrection, or that if they would have seen a vision of somebody, that would have been evidence that they were dead. I don't think that's true. And I think the gospels themselves refute that idea. So, all right. James's book. Yeah, Bourbon. James's book. I think it's the only book he's written as far as I know, but I think his book is called Unreasonable Faith. It's just an answer to William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith, but he has a whole chapter going over the resurrection, and he makes a lot of good points in there. He quotes a lot. What's interesting to me is his case is very dependent on sociology and psychology, which my case is too. There's a freaking fly flying around here, so if you can see that, that's extremely annoying. But anyways, he quotes a lot of he quotes a lot of scholars and their studies, and so I think that that's really helpful. He quotes a lot of psychology studies and sociology studies and some anthropology. So yeah, I would recommend checking out his book. I actually checked out. I wanted to look at his book specifically for that chapter. So you can buy the book just for that chapter alone. There's a fly, and I want to hit it. Okay. And it's that chapter is 100 pages. You can also, he did a reply to David Paulman at Faith Because of Reason. And Paulman is a maximal case apologist. And so Fodor does to David Paulman. And so you can kind of see there how the RHBS model can be fit to apply to the maximalist case. All right. So I'm just going to read a couple more comments, guys, and then we'll wrap this up. So thank you for watching me for the last hour and a half. It's frustrating when apologists will insist there's not data behind the apocalypticism catalyzing resurrection belief idea. Maybe that's true if data just means taking the gospels at face value. Well, but here's the thing. So again, if you watch the video I just made, which not a lot of people have watched my last video, maybe it's the thumbnail. But anyways, in that last video about failed prophecy, We don't even have to look at the Gospels. Just look at the epistles. Look at Paul, look at James, look at Peter, look at Revelation. They all clearly expected, they all had apocalyptic beliefs. They all believed that the end of the world was coming and that Jesus was returning soon. So we know that the early church was apocalyptic. We don't even if you don't think Jesus was apocalyptic, if we know the early church was apocalyptic, this gives us a breeding ground for them to interpret whatever they encountered with a resuscitated Jesus. That gives us a background that we can interpret, or that they would have interpreted those visions or those encounters in an apocalyptic sense, and which then would have caused them very likely to infer an end of times resurrection, or that Jesus had resurrected. So yeah, that's a really, really good point. I think the apocalypticism catalyzing resurrection belief that you highlighted there is really, really crucial. And it's pretty much ironclad, I think, because we have the epistles that clearly promulgate a belief in apocalypticism. Okay. Maybe Muhammad was also John the Baptist raised from the dead. That's right. Maybe he was. All right. I've heard of like Gary Habermas and the minimal facts thing, but I'm not really familiar with the maximal case argument. Yeah. So maximal case, they assume that, so maximal case is predicated on that the Gospels go back to eyewitnesses. I believe, I hope I'm not mischaracterizing the maximalist case, but the maximalist case is predicated on them making first a case for like gospel reliability. So they assume, number one, that the Gospels are generally reliable and that they go back to what the eyewitnesses at least originally believed. They're not saying the maximalist case is not, because some skeptics assume that the maximalist case just assumes that the Gospels are true. That's not the maximalist case. They just assume that what we see in the Gospels is what the original disciples generally believed. That's the maximalist case. Yeah, so Resurrection Nerd makes a good point. He says, you can also see how the apocalypticism gets muted and then erased as time goes on. Absolutely. I'll probably have a video on this in the future as well. Like Mark and Matthew are heavily apocalyptic, and then Luke mutes it a little bit. And in fact, Luke adds the verse about Jesus saying like, oh, the kingdom of God is not coming with things that can be seen, which you don't see in Matthew and Mark, which kind of hints towards, oh, the kingdom of God might not be a literal kingdom. And then in John, like the kingdom of God's not really there at all, right? And even when it is, it's kind of spiritualized. So yeah, good point. And it's something that I plan on making a video about at some point. So all right, last one, and then I'm going to log off here, guys. So it says there's a thing in the pseudo-Clementines about how all the major prophets are reincarnations of the same divine being, but I might totally be... I don't know about that. I don't know much about the pseudo-Clementines, so I'll have to check that out. There's plenty I still need to learn, especially like in early church fathers and early church writings. If it's not in the Bible, I don't know too much about it. I know more about like the Gospels themselves and the epistles. So, all right. This was my first stream, guys. Thank you so much for those of you that were hanging out. I really appreciate it. I had a good time. It was interesting with the small technical difficulties. I'm glad I didn't have more. But again, thank you guys for those of you that were here and contributing in the comments. I'll try to do more live streams in the future. So thanks, guys. Have a good one, and we'll see you at some point in the future. See ya.